Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome very much to Oh, What a Lovely Recovery. My name is Ronan Palmer. I direct the Clean Economy program at E3G, and I'm delighted to be joined this morning at the end of, or coming towards the end of London Climate Action Week by three wonderful colleagues. We have billed this as a fireside chat. This is a conversation between people who are observing the recovery from COVID, but I would indeed say the changes in the global economy over the last decade leading up to COVID and beyond. I'm going to ask these people to comment and reflect on where we're at now and their hopes and fears for the future. We are going to converse and talk about this, but we're going to converse and talk with all of you. So I really hope that you are participating, that you're putting questions in the chat or the Q&A function. We will be picking these up as we go along. We're really keen to hear from everybody. The event is being recorded. It will appear on E3G's YouTube channel. So I'm hoping we can generate some ongoing conversation from this. And I'm hoping that you will all participate in this ongoing conversation, even after this webinar is finished. So without further ado, what are we doing today? What has brought us together today? People like us have all been looking at the recovery, been reflecting on how well it's been going or how not well it's been going. Some of us are fortunate enough to live in countries with a plenitude of vaccines, where everything seems to be going back to normal. And yet we also know that there are different variants of the virus. We know that many countries are actually in very different positions. E3G is a climate change think tank. We've done our own tracking of the recovery. Our friends at Vivid Economics have done some tracking. Our friends at CP, represented by Philip today, have done their tracking. So we now want to have a reflection on that quiet moment of talking and thinking as to where we really are. Trackers tell us one story. What other stories are we hearing? So I'm now going to pass over to my three colleagues. I'm going to take them in reverse order. And I was trying to work out how reverse order worked. So I'm going to start with Shaheen. I'm going to move to Philip, and I'm going to then move to Hannah. Just a few minutes, Shaheen, on your reflections on where the world, its economy, and indeed its progress is going, and what you're looking forward to, and maybe what you're worried about.
Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you to E3G for this invitation. Well, I'm actually quite worried. I sit in Europe. I work in between Paris and Berlin, and I've been following very closely the European efforts related to the recovery. I've followed a bit less what has happened in the rest of the world, and that's why I think this panel is great to complement this very European view. Maybe I'll take a step back, and one thing that I think is important to have in mind is that I think we have designed, by and large, especially in Europe, but not only in Europe, the recovery package as though the epidemic was a brief and momentary interruption in production, and that we had successfully put the economy on hold by more or less freezing it, and that everything could resume back to normal as soon as the pandemic would fade. And I think that idea is proving to be increasingly wrong. In fact, now a number of epidemiologists are considering that COVID has become endemic, meaning it's not going to go away, or if it goes away, it's going to take a long time. And therefore, we're not in front of a brief interruption in economic activity that we can solve through vast amounts of liquidity for a short period of time, and then a return to normalcy. The quick way of saying it is that there will be no quick return to normalcy, and therefore our policy framework needs to take that into account, and at the moment it hasn't really. So that's for the big picture. We don't have a policy package that's designed for an endemicity of COVID, and we're seeing it now, with the resumption of the Delta variant and the risks of further and new variants, we are basically probably in the need for a long-lasting economic support, and that I think changes a bit the way we have to approach it. That's for the big picture. Now, I think Europe has been quite successful in sort of putting the economy on hold and on freeze by providing a lot of support to the business sector and to individuals. And I think the European social safety nets have proven to be quite effective to do that. What the European package is proving less effective to do is actually to prepare us on the way out of the pandemic and basically make sure that the economy is ready to reopen and ready to enable the sort of structural shifts that the pandemic has caused, and to accelerate the transition. Europe, as you know, has put together a quite large European recovery package, which Europeans tend to be very proud of. And I think they're right to be, in the sense that it is politically a very meaningful event. The fact that the EU was able to assemble a common borrowing, common spending in such a short period of time, I think must be commended. That being said, it's not because it's a political success that it's an economic one. And my concern is that the European recovery package is in size insufficient, and it's in its form not exactly meeting the objectives that we have set for this plan. That is, achieve and accelerate the energy and climate transition, and achieve and accelerate the digitalization of the economy. On both of these fronts, which were the two building blocks of the plan, we are, I think, lagging behind, and we're lacking a centralized decision-making power to actually decide on the investment at the European level. As you probably know, the European Recovery Plan, in fact, works as a pot of money that is then being distributed and allocated to member states that are, and so therefore the distribution of the funds depends on the spending capacity of each and every member state. And the last point before I finish, the second aspect of the European fiscal response is what happens at the national member state level. And here I have two sets of worries. The first one is that, as you know, we have put European fiscal rules on hold during this crisis. And actually, the European Commission has stated that we would only return to these rules in 2023. At the time, that sounded like an extremely generous offer. And the more time passes, the more we realize that actually this is quite a short time away. And the uncertainty over the return of the rules is actually holding back fiscal policy today. And so my big concern is that because we are not engaging frontally on a discussion about a reform of the European fiscal rules, we're holding back fiscal policy today in a number of member states. I think the economic situation and the epidemic situation would warrant more fiscal expansion at the national level. And that fiscal expansion is not taking place in large part because we are worried about the set of rules that will apply to national public finances going forward. And I think that's a big stumbling block. The European Commission has promised a legislative proposal for reforming the rules by the end of the year. And I fear that given the German elections and probably the difficulty of forming a coalition in Germany after the election, and then the French elections coming next year, there will be little appetite to put a very bold proposal on the table. And so I worry that national fiscal policy will be held back for longer, and that the political appetite and impetus for expanding the European aspect of the recovery plan will not be there before quite a while. So my fear is that Europe is stuck in a recovery that is in size and in scope too narrow, and that will create important economic risks for the medium term, but also climate-related risks, because I think that will delay our transition. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Dane, thank you very much. That was very interesting. One of the questions we will come back to is you did use the phrase about normal. I will be asking you, was there ever a normal, or was there ever over the last decade a normal? It's something we're doing some work on at the moment. Philip, please, looking forward to your reflections.
Yes, good morning, Ronan and colleagues. This is Philip Schondrott from CEPEI in Colombia. And actually, I wanted to talk, following up Shine's comments, on a regional view about Latin America and the Caribbean, being very dispersed in their size and also on the response and recovery of COVID-19. We have 33 countries, almost 600 million inhabitants, but we have countries of the size of Brazil and as small as Paraguay or Trinidad and Tobago. And when I heard the comments about Europe and thinking about how should I present now actually a Latin American and Caribbean view without a safety net, without joint regional programs that we could actually address at this very moment. So going back to your question, Ronan, the initial one, I would say, first of all, it is not over yet, and not for a lot of people in our region. It is actually just starting to have the most worrisome effects. What we have to see, and before that normal world that you were addressing, is that we live in a very unequal world, and our region, it's the most unequal region in the world. So that means a lot when a pandemic hits. And I believe that these inequalities, we are seeing them in different levels. And I would raise the level first of the digital divide, the digital inequality that we are seeing. So in order to address really the points that we are seeing with socioeconomic response, it is necessary to have good data. And we are seeing that this is not happening at all its levels. And we are especially seeing that a lot of the data that we have, it's not really being used to meet smart policy choices at this very moment. So the most optimistic views in our region suggest that this is really an opportunity for to create more sustainable societies and economies. And I would say the most negative ones estimate that once that the pandemic is over, the rules of the game will not change dramatically beyond some strictly necessary adaptations. And I'm in that second, less optimistic view, that I'm not seeing the real changes and a wake-up call in our regions. I'm seeing more political swifts than real views or policy changes for medium and long-time recovery. And I would also say that the spending announced for the 2020 recovery is disappointing in the picture of overall green priorities. And there we are very much into the same numbers that Oxford and UNEP just presented, around 18% of the recovery spending, and just 2.5% of the spending has been positive in green characteristics. And that is something that also makes us a lot of concern and ask us, why is that actually happening? And this comes back to very basic reasons. First of all, it's our economic practices, and because we are highly dependent on extractive activities, that's our primary economy, it's the exploitation of natural resources. So this is not going to change a day or to another. And the main problem that we're seeing is that we're not sticking together to the international agreements that we have signed up in the region. And we are now blaming actually COVID for something that was off track way before in 2020 and 2029 as well. So I believe that is something to have in mind as well. So what has been done, and I believe we should talk about vaccine justice, and later on in the conversation, most probably we can bring in some more examples, because what we have done through the work that we're doing with the multi-donor trust fund of the UN and also some tech companies like Tableau, and bringing together a data and innovation center on COVID-19 for middle and low income countries, it is especially seeing what vaccine justice is actually happening in our region. If we see the ratios of those countries that I just mentioned to the high income countries, we have a difference that 97% of high income low-income countries, Ronan and colleagues, have now access to a vaccination program. But only 60% of people living in low-income countries actually have the access to a vaccination program. So we're talking about, in real economic terms, that as of May of this year, we will have a herd immunity in less than 8 months in the OECD, that countries, but it would take us even more than 10 years for low-income countries to come to that numbers. So I believe that's where our discussion has to go as well, besides of what I already mentioned on the green recovery side. So that was my initial thinking. And like I mentioned at the beginning, it is hard to talk about our only regional view because it has been very segmented in the way that country has responded. And I just mentioned how responsible and irresponsible it has been. If you see countries like Brazil, where we even have a denier of COVID running the country right now, it doesn't help very much. And that this at the end is even used to have less a greener economy. That's something that the focus is not shifted into the right direction. And we do have also to see how effective we have been in the vaccination process. Chile is a good example of this. They have been very successful in the vaccination process, but they had to shut down several times in the last couple of weeks their capital. So what is actually happening? How effective is this really on the ground? And who are we vaccinating? And actually, are we getting to a herd immunity or not? And then we have also more successful countries to see with examples in Central America and even in the Caribbean, smaller countries that have had the possibility to actually work out this time for greener recoveries. But since their dependence on tourism is that high, their economies have been hit as well. So simply to bring you in a little bit of the context of where we are in the different regions and sub-regions in Latin America and the Caribbean, and not to make this a monologue now, I will give over to you again, Ronan, and hopefully from there we can discuss a little bit further. But thank you for the moment.
No, not at all, Philip. Thank you. And your mention of data reminds me of your own team's work on data. We must make sure we post that in the chat so people have access to it, because it's really very interesting. Hannah, let's hear from you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this, and great to hear the remarks from Philip and Shaheen on the different regions. I'm often never sure whether I should be talking about kind of Asia or Africa in some of these discussions, because effectively, despite COVID-19, I have feet in both. Because a lot of the work that my firm does is both Africa focused and also Asia focused. But let me kind of do a sort of, I will probably most likely focus most on Africa in some ways, but I think there's some really useful lessons coming out from Asia. And I think in particular, in terms of recovery and what recovery really means, whether it's a long-term or a short-term, etc. Normal, as you said, Ronan. But let me begin by saying, and what I usually begin with when talking about recovery is what COVID-19 has really kind of helped us to understand. We've both been able to see and expose what COVID-19 has exposed is both vulnerabilities and some opportunities. In terms of the vulnerabilities, I think we kind of all know all of them, but I think the most important one that we must remember, or I guess there's two really important ones that we must remember, is that before COVID-19, we had all of these assessments about how well prepared developed economies were, etc., for dealing with health crises. And what we have found is that that is not a simple picture. And we have found that there are some very small, low-income countries, very low GDP, who have managed COVID-19 very, very well, and will effectively, and I'll come back to this later, will have to continue doing so. So that's number one. And the other thing that it's exposed is that there are certain economies who are very marginalized from the rest of the world, in particular Africa, a number of African economies, but overall marginalized from the rest of the world. And so as a result, some of the impacts of COVID-19 were felt later. And so some countries had more time to prepare effectively, and including through their own kind of regional coordination bodies like Africa CDC, to be able to prepare for how to deal with COVID-19. And that preparation has set them up very well, because they also looked at experience across the world, just not just in one place. But that marginalization is not a good thing, but it has helped with COVID-19 management. But as vaccines, and again, I'll come back to this in terms of vaccines, that further recovery is going to be put off. We've also learned, so there are vulnerabilities that have been exposed. We've also seen opportunities. You know, this webinar itself, we keep saying it, the digital opportunity, really important. Not just important in terms of just being able to talk and not travel and so on, but it is also an opportunity to think about what kind of infrastructure low-income countries really fundamentally need, and an opportunity for green recovery. There are a number of overlaps in the kind of green and COVID-19 recovery, which can be exploited, especially if there's going to be long-term investments coming out of COVID-19. I say a big if, because that's not yet clear whether those investments will come through and where the financing will come for that. But things like, you know, digital infrastructure for children to be able to get access to school when schools have to be closed, and even when you're talking about e-commerce, opportunities for green infrastructure, not just green energy, but green transport, rail, way more COVID-19 friendly than roads, for instance, and so on. So I think these opportunities we must keep an eye on, and not forget that we should remember that we have to try and invest in those if possible. But I think the biggest challenge of COVID-19, and I think the biggest challenge to recovery, global recovery, and a truly global recovery, is that what COVID-19 has exposed is the serious fault lines in our multilateral system. When it comes to finance, when it comes to distribution, it's not just about a lack of finance, it's also how responsibilities are distributed through the multilateral system. I recently wrote a piece for SCMP, South China Morning Post, on the vaccine famine that is being created. And we're seeing the impact of the vaccine famine. And the vaccine famine is not just because, you know, there haven't been enough donations. It is because of the specific setup of the multilateral system, which means that countries that put money into multilateral organizations are then effectively seem to be exempted from its implications, and are then not incorporated in, for example, distribution mechanisms. And because they don't want to give up sovereignty to the same degree that low-income and middle-income countries have to give up sovereignty once they're part of the multilateral system. So there are some serious fault lines, which I would say we really need to, if we are going to truly recover, we need to deal with these, because the impartial, inequitable way that the multilateral system is working is going to continually destroy any kinds of recovery efforts. So, and we've seen that with the new variants, we've seen that with the Delta variant, for instance. We're seeing it in Asia right now, and countries are really trying to kind of work out how to deal with that. So I think if we can find a way through all the different multilateral mechanisms that we're all thinking about right now, whether it's climate change recovery funds or just climate funds, green climate fund, what do we do with that? If we're thinking about special drawing rights as well, for instance, we need to really think carefully about how these new instruments that we're talking about will actually address these fault lines and make sure that everybody has an equal chance, an equal entitlement to be able to recover, so that there aren't further famines created, which will really hurt and destroy lives. So let me, and I want to be optimistic about that, but let me finish, because we can discuss all of these things, and yeah, we can discuss what can be done.
Anna, thank you very much. I've posted what I think is your South China Morning Post article on vaccine famine. But I have also just turned into my name because despite living in the city where Apple has its European headquarters, our broadband suddenly seems to have died. So if all your Apple help desk calls aren't getting through, I think I know why. So please bear with me for a few moments if I only appear as a disembodied voice. Folks, there's so much to pick up in all of that. I think there is something about that both Philip and Shaheen talked about the kind of the base on which this crisis has been built. So, you know, that there wasn't a perfect world in 2019. It had problems. And actually, it's, you know, it is, exactly as you said, Anna, it's driven some of the vulnerabilities further. It has also picked up on some of the opportunities that this last year. So I'd like to pursue that a bit. I think there is this question about the multilateral system and how it's played together. And I very much welcome people's thoughts about so how well is the international global system doing? How well are our friends at G7 doing? How well are our friends at the UN or at G20? What hopes and fears do we have for those? So, but could I start just with this sense of where were we in 2019? And could we just reflect a little bit more? I mean, is normal something we want to go back to? Who would pick that up?
I can start because maybe what I said about return to normalcy may have been misconstrued. I didn't mean to say that the world in 2019 was any normal world we would wish to go back to. I was just saying that, you know, we've built our economic policy response as though we were just living an exceptional moment that we needed to deal with, and that, you know, somehow you know, everything would return. And this is basically what economic models work like. You know, economic models have a trend, and then there's a shock, and then after this shock, we return to that trend, regardless of what we think of that pre-existing trend. And I was just trying to challenge that. I think indeed the world of 2019 is not a world we would wish to go back to, for a number of reasons: inequality, lack of focus on climate change and energy transition. And maybe in some of these aspects, at least on the energy and climate transition, we are saying that we don't want to return to the status quo ante. Are we putting the policies in place to do that? I'm a bit more circumspect. And here I'd like to touch on your point about international cooperation. It is striking for somebody like me, who has been very focused on economic policy coordination and who has sort of, you know, witnessed firsthand the degree of economic policy coordination that was achieved in 2009, 2010. If you think of the work of the G20, then the London summit, it's in fact a far greater degree of coordination for a shock that in retrospect appears to be far smaller than the one we are experiencing now. And that's a very striking thing. The G7 has barely spoken about international economic policy coordination. The US, in fact, through, you know, its very large fiscal stimulus, is subsidizing the recovery of the entire world without demanding that the EU, that China, or the rest of the world pays its fair share. And that's a very striking departure from the Obama administration, which had tried to organize for as long as it could a degree of a coordination on economic policy stimulus. So I take your point, Ronan. I think international economic policy coordination is very weak, and it's very strange because we are at a moment where it's most needed. And I'm talking about what I know best, which is economic policy coordination. When we, but reading a little bit what health policy specialists say, it seems that on that front too, there has been quite a breakdown, and the scandals around, WHO and what the US did with it and all that, I think speaks to that. So in brief, I think we have a big problem of global governance. And I think, we could be fairly proud of what we had achieved with the global financial crisis insofar as economic policy. And I'm not saying that the policy response was perfect, but what we're doing now is quite a notch below what we were doing some 10 years ago.
Thanks, Shaheen. Philip.
Yes, your question of if we want to go back to normal and whatever normal means these days, my answer would be straightforward no, because that normal that we were before was already going over two red lines that I believe are important to mention. The first one is the Earth's capacities to maintain our life cycles, and the second one is human dignity. And both of them were off track already in 2019. When the pandemic hit us then, I was actually optimist that multilateralism would reemerge as the big player here. And it did in certain ways, because it showed it was the only way actually that we could work together, and we had a platform. The main problem was then, I would say, first of all, this nationalistic view that we had in all regions of the world. And in ours, it was, first of all, the funding for multilateralism. I think the member states, especially towards what has been the United Nations, have lacked of funding. I mean, here we should have seen a big response to it, and we did not see it. And the second one is actually a hybrid. When we see the COVAX vaccine initiative, if we see it in numbers, it's the biggest in the world that we have ever seen in order to get the world vaccinated. In coordination, it's picking up. So I would not be that pessimistic about it, but I have a major problem on governance issues and on funding issues when it comes then to multilateralism and what has happened here. The other big thing is I'm missing the cross-regional cooperation. And I believe here multilateralism can play a big role, and we as think tankers as well, which is my dream is to see, for example, Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean working together on common challenges, because we have a lot of commonalities that are happening at this very moment. Earlier in the conversation in the green room, we were talking about how these waves actually are coming from Latin America, spilling over to Africa, and we're seeing a certain pattern that it's repetitive here. And I believe that cross-regional cooperation is something we need to aim for in order to have greener technologies, have economic tools and policies that are in place, and that we are really talking about best practices, not only on paper, but sharing that knowledge in the real world and in real time. So that would be my answer of going back. Ronan, I would not lie to you that there are certain things I would like to come back, and it's not doing a webinar with you anymore, for example, and not talking to a screen anymore, but seeing real people just for the beginning. But that's quite selfish to say, and a luxury problem when we see, for example, the people in Latin America and the Caribbean talking about economic debates. That's not a theoretical exercise. It's everyday life, very concrete issues that we are facing, and even talking about existing itself. So I believe that's getting back to the baseline, that we should have this debate as well, because we are seeing that this is necessary in our region and far beyond as well.
So let me take that as well, Ronan. I think this is a really good question, and I've been doing some work with UNSCAP recently, and one of the key points they make is we're not trying to build back better, we're trying to build forward. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of it's not, and it's explicitly saying building back is not where we're aiming for. We're not trying to go back to the past, because it did have so many fault lines, it did have so many problems, and I think Philip and Shaheen have kind of set out exactly what those were. I think we should look in two directions kind of going forward. Definitely we have to work on the multilateral system, but how we're going to do that, we do need consensus to do that. And I think we will need a lot more low and middle income countries to really make their voices heard, to chart out what that looks like. It's been done before. You know, I was a climate negotiator, and in climate negotiations, we worked so hard to shape that architecture and shape what that looks like. I think that can be done, but it may just emerge slowly. So in between that, I think we need to remember first that in terms of normal, looking at China, and we have to look at China, a place where we found COVID-19 first. How has it dealt? It has eliminated COVID-19 domestically, literally eliminated. Yesterday, they announced that they're creating a new quarantine center, 5,000 people quarantine center in Guangzhou, to be able for people to come in and out of China. So they will effectively come through Guangzhou and go to the rest of the country. That is how China is preparing for post-COVID-19, actual post-COVID-19. And inside China, everyone is traveling. People, of course, still wear masks because they feel like they should. And if they get, kind of colds and so on, they will wear masks. But they're gathering, and life is back to normal in that sense. But it's not normal in terms of managing pandemics and managing how COVID-19 is dealt with. So we have to, I think it's important for us to keep an eye on what's happening there, because it might mean, it could also be useful for people to think about that going forwards. The other aspect, and I'm really grateful to Philip for mentioning it, the regional cooperation. I think in 2019, what was happening from African economies side is we were working towards creating the AFCFTA. That came into place, and it is providing a new kind of impetus and momentum for greater regional cooperation. And that is showing itself to be very effective in COVID-19, because there's one key agency, the African CDC, and it has been incredibly helpful in terms of providing consistent guidance, helping countries work out, and tracking what's going on in Africa. It's hard to do so. My firm tried to do so, and we still do so with monthly kind of updates. But nevertheless, helping and coordinating health ministers, and in order to ensure that those waves do not become exponential as they have done elsewhere. And with that kind of momentum, and with the AFCFTA, there is a real push for more African regional organization on a lot of different areas, including not just trade, but also economic, financial, etc. So I think that there will be more momentum around that, and that will be not normal, but good.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I stand slightly corrected, quite corrected, I think, on my willful misinterpretation of what Shaheen said. It is a subject very dear to my heart, as you know. Now, my good friend and colleague Linus Mofer from UNECA has asked a question which I was also thinking about. And by the way, I will put a link into the chat to the excellent report. I have to say this because we were involved in it, that UNECA did on building forward better. And we should also shout out to the other UN economic commissions who have done some really good thinking on what should be done. Linus's question is really very simple. What about austerity going forward?
Maybe I'll start, because I think the place where this conversation is most acute is actually in Europe. There's actually been a striking shift intellectually around these issues in the US. And I'm sorry to go back to the global financial crisis again, but if you remember, the pressure under which the Obama administration was very quickly after passing its stimulus bill to consolidate, a pressure that was, and this is where, going back to the question of international economic policy coordination, a pressure that was, coming domestically from the Republicans, but that was also finding a lot of echoes in Europe. Both in the UK after the election of the Cameron government, but also in Germany very quickly, which, after passing a large stimulus bill in 2008, the EU was very quickly thinking about consolidating, and indeed started consolidating in 2010, creating a double dip recession in 2011. So you would think we would have learned a lot from these mistakes and that we would never repeat them again. And that's not exactly my impression. I actually fear that, in part because of what I said about our inability to think about modernizing our fiscal rules, we take the risk of trying to return to normal, that is, a return to a framework that is sort of structurally biased towards consolidation too soon. And so I think the risk of a return to austerity or simply just insufficient economic policy support is real. It is real in the UK, and it is real on the continent. I think the shape and of the economic policy conversation in Europe, and in particular in Germany for that matter, which really serves as a bellwether for the conversation on the continent, will be critical. And this is why the elections that are taking place in September in Germany, in my view, are quite central to this discussion. Depending on the shape and form of the coalition that takes hold after the September 21st election in Germany, this fiscal consolidation conversation may take one turn or another. I still want to be hopeful that we're not going to repeat the mistakes of the past, but I have to confess that at the moment, there is not enough elements on the table for me to be entirely confident that this will be the case. And so I think the moments between, really the fall of this year, where we'll start preparing the budget for 2022, which will be very important because these are the budget we will be preparing in Europe, thinking that in 2023, we will, be applying the fiscal rules again. So I think that moment in the fall is going to be critical. And going back to your question, Ronan, I think, if the US, or more broadly speaking, the G20, can be a venue to ensure that there is no premature consolidation anywhere, and I think where the risk is most acute in Europe, I think that would be a very positive contribution. And I'm struck that so far the US administration hasn't been pushing this agenda very much, which is strange considering the amount of fiscal expansion that the US administration is preparing. And so, in the absence of a commensurate expansion in Europe, we are going to see a very large imbalance building up between the US and Europe. And I think that is liable to create tensions down the line. So I think, in order to avoid these future global imbalances and the tensions that they bring, it's in the interest of everyone to make sure that there is some alignment in the fiscal policy impulse in the short term.
Can I come in there as well, Ronan, in terms of austerity?
Yes, please, Hannah.
So I think perhaps one reason that there is not such a big discussion around austerity with regards to Europe and US is there's a huge new allocation of special drawing rights that's just been agreed. And so that should help in terms of central bank reserves and so on. So I imagine that is somewhat taking care of that decision, but of those issues, but nevertheless, it would be interesting to see whether more is required, and as Shaheen has set out. I think for the rest of the world, however, we should really look not just to 2009, but a lot further back into the 1980s, where we had a shock, an external shock from oil crisis, which drove interest rates up. and drove debt levels up, external debt levels up. And then there was a whole program of effectively forced austerity through a number of programs with IMF, World Bank, etc., through the 1990s, and eventually then brought down through the HIPC initiative and so on. And so that's why we all see all those graphs starting 2000, where since 2000 debt levels have increased. But if you go back into the 1980s, debt levels were actually still going up for quite some time. What we don't want to do, I think, is to fall into those same traps. It's bad for the world. It was also extremely bad for poor people around the world to have to have so much constraints in terms of fiscal spending, in terms of infrastructure building and maintenance and so on. And effectively from 2000 is when countries were trying to really recover. 20 years later, we do not want to be waiting 20 years for countries to have to start recovering from COVID-19. And that's maybe where, if they have to face austerity, that will be what they're having to do. So I think we have to be really careful of, and we really need to take very seriously the idea of not just providing liquidity for now. It's very important to provide liquidity for now. That should have been done in 2020. It wasn't done to the degree that it was required, especially in terms of private sector kind of debt moratoriums. It was done by the bilaterals, which is great. Private sector multilaterals have not yet done enough. But there is a key issue with how do countries get back onto that trend of increasing their investments. And I say investments specifically, not to, because it's not, we shouldn't always be talking about debt as just spending. Much of it is building assets. We don't record it. IMF doesn't record it. Nobody records what assets people are actually building, except countries themselves. But they do have an impact, and that is really important for countries to be able to resume that path. And I do hope that we'll start to think through how we do that to avoid waiting for 20 years.
I'm very struck by the thing you say about, debt is one side of an equation which typically has an asset on the other side, and it goes back to that wonderful thing that Philip said about the, what was happening pre-COVID, and particularly that capacity to maintain lifestyles. And capacity depends an awful lot on capital. It depends on our own investments, and it also depends on natural capital, the climate, the environment around us. It's a very strong reminder of the need to think that through. Philip, did you want to reflect on that?
Yes, well, I want to actually complement what has already been said, and it is the budget discussion on 2022. I sometimes get the impression that we are still not feeling and seeing how development and sustainable development looks like in our regions, because the responses that we are getting and how actually we are planning ahead, it's really not, it's not the feeling that I get when I'm out of the streets and seeing what is happening. And I think I'm still in a very big bubble when it comes to see realities on the ground in our regions, because they are much deeper right now than ever before. So I believe stimulus packages have to be smart, and we have said that once and again, but we have actually already good ideas of it. I saw here in the chat, Linus, as well, you run on putting the Regional Economic Commission's report forward. I believe that are very good words from the different 5 regions where they are located in, and they give us good ideas. But how much are policymakers and those that influence them really listening? And that's where I believe we need also policy trackers and making them more accountable. We have talked about this 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times, most probably. But how is this being done done and how much actually we are pushing those commissions in Parliament actually forward into that discussion, I think we're still doing a quite lousy job, to be very autocritical here, because we need to push for smarter policies and a green and a much building forward better. I like not only the language, I believe that's the ones that we should use, better than build back better. That sounds more as a political slogan. So being with the smart policies, it's something that we have to bring them closer to those in parliaments and also in the Ministry of Finance. I sometimes believe we're talking to the wrong people when it comes about response and recovery, and who's actually right now in the table to making those decisions. When we look at, and especially when we talk about green recovery, how many ministries of environment are really sitting in the table and having a clear word and a decision-making vote that brings them closer for green recoveries? And I'm not seeing that really in our region happening. So that's somehow my concerns on top of what I have heard from my colleagues that have expressed it much more eloquently. So over to you, Ronan, again.
Well, folks, I'm reminded, and particularly by a question that Amy Dodd has just asked us. And by the way, a big shout out to the excellent work that the One Foundation is one organization is doing. But Amy is actually pushing us, I think quite rightly, to draw this meeting to a close by thinking a bit more about, so now what could people do? It is that thing, we've sat around the fire, we have said, what a shame, these things aren't happening. Let's give them a push. So Amy asked us specifically about getting the challenge of getting multilateral and private creditors to act on the debt issue. So brief thoughts on that, but also what is kind of the one thing that people here would like to inject back into the particularly the multilateral system? And I don't just mean cash here. I mean, what is do we want to see people doing? So who'd like to start? And you can take the creditors first, or the first people you kind of give a push to, and then beyond. Philip, are you volunteering by not disappearing?
Yeah, actually, I would have loved that Hannah would be the first one so we can shine afterwards. But okay, sometimes you have to take that first shot and then probably you shine later. I would say, I mean, I'm obsessed with knowledge and actually knowledge management. And I think we are still not learning enough of how these processes came into action. And I'm also obsessed with data. And when I'm always talking about data, we have not talked about the interoperability of the data and how we can use it during a pandemic. We have seen that the ecosystem and the enabling environment are still not set for that. And I believe that's the big point that I would like to raise, that we have to learn from this pandemic. We have to be smarter, not only in the future, right now as well. And we have to create a real enabling environment for data to be exchanged, used, and actually reused as well, so that our national statistical systems are integrated, that the different stakeholders really have a part in this. And we cannot only talk about the value of data and big tech firms and comms firms producing it, but how can we actually get closer to it? And how is this actually, for us, a main driver and a trigger effect to do our work better? Because the amounts of data that we are receiving are enormous. How much are we really using? That's a big question. How much is the quality and the timeliness of this data still? That's our big question mark. So I believe we can boost that and we can actually move forward. And this has to do with capacities. This has to do with trust and maturity within the processes, but it also has to have the right enabling environment to do so. So that would be my final ideas on your question. And if I don't have the opportunity, since time is running out, it has been a real pleasure, because this conversation could go on forever if we will be in my region, Latin America and the Caribbean, in order to bring there a little bit of tropical swing into it as well. So over to you, Rona.
I'm ready to pass it right over to Hannah, particularly because of the creditor piece, as Philip pointed out, but the creditors and beyond, Hannah.
Yeah, I think so. There's lots of long-term and short-term actions that can be taken. I think in the short term, the conversation at the minute tends to be just kind of taking it as a given that private creditors are not going to do anything because they haven't done anything in 2020. But that doesn't mean that they should necessarily be let off the hook. And so I do think there should still be kind of questions as to why private sector creditors are not providing debt moratoriums even into 2021, a whole year later. And as well as continued work into things like the liquidity sustainability framework, which UNECA have been working really hard on, and kind of mechanisms like that, which try to pool the existing debt obligations and make that kind of work more effectively, bring down interest rates, bring down risk, and find ways to do that. And I think those kinds of facilities or tools can even be used into the long term. I've proposed, my organization, my consultancy, we've proposed a borrowers club as an idea that is something which could be brought into place as a result of thinking through some of these problematic functions of the financial system. I would also say in terms of multilaterals, I think the big agenda is in terms of special drawing rights, engaging on how those are reallocated. We already know what the allocation would be because it's a very easy, simple formula that gives lots of the developed countries lots of SDRs who don't need them necessarily. I know about the reserves, but others need them more. So how does that reallocation happen? Pressure on the multilaterals to be a bit more creative rather than just using their own mechanisms. And then in terms of changes to the multilateral system, Ronan, I think we should not take it as a given. I think if there's anything that I would like people to go away from today is not to take it as a given and to support multilateral organizations or shifts in the multilateral system, which gives more agency to the developing countries, African economies in particular, who have shown themselves, a lot of them, most of them, to be very responsible when it comes to COVID-19, and as much as they can with the limited resources that they have. So let's focus on those. That would be what I suggest.
Excellent, thank you, Shaheen.
Well, I think these words of wisdom by Hannah were amazing. So I don't have very much to add. Maybe just a word on what she said about multilateralism. I think we've lived over the last few years the recognition through a pandemic and through I think the acceptance of the climate emergency. We've lived through the acute need of much stronger and much more effective multilateral organizations, international cooperation. And I don't think we're living up to that challenge. So, Anna has mentioned a few areas where I think that, where that challenge is particularly acute. But I think, broadly speaking, we have had a real breakdown of the international cooperative framework, in part because of the Trump administration, but I don't think it would be fair to only limit the responsibility to the Trump administration. So I think that there's a real urgency there to realize that a lot of these issues can be solved by one or two great countries. They have to be solved through multilateral and international coordination. And in reality is that our institutions, as old and as good as they might be, are yet, fairly ineffective in delivering the sort of cooperation we need. And so that I think is the great challenge of our generation almost.
Shane, thank you very much. Philip, Hannah, thank you all very much. That has been a really excellent conversation. I really hope we can continue this conversation. I'm really grateful to my colleagues at E3G and London Climate Action Week for helping us do this, and for all the participants for engaging. I think I heard Philip inviting us all to do this again next year, somewhere perhaps in that lovely garden of yours, Philip. I would look forward to that. Let us see what the next 12 months brings and see how much further we advance on the way. Thank you all very much.